Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Jackie Lynch with Flagship Solutions Group, and I want to thank you for attending this session. This session is going to be on some of the top tips for taking care of your VIO server, and it is split into two parts. In part one, we're going to cover some prerequisites, some fundamentals. We'll talk about documentation and the need for dual VIOs. We'll go into some of the things related to fixes, and then we'll also talk about installation and maintenance and doing upgrades. So let's start off with some of the prerequisites. There are a lot of changes that came in with PowerVM version 3.1, and it's been around since November 2018. There are lots of service packs and mini packs out today, and this is basically where the VIO server moved from AIX 6.1 to AIX 7.2. It provided native compatibility mode for Power 8 and Power 9 and above. It did some things with LPM. It also allowed you to use a USB flash drive to install your VIO servers. And they now provide a flash image that you can use for installations and upgrades. And as you can see below, there are a number of other items that were also included as part of the PowerVM 3.1 changes. Due to the delivery date for the presentation, it will focus on version 3.1.2. However, I wanted to note that PowerVM 3.1.3 was announced on September 8th with an effective date of September 10th. And the primary things in 3.1.3 are the Power 10 support, some changes to live partition mobility, and also the VIO server maintenance tool, which will provide backups and restores and verify the redundancy for dual VIOS and VIOS setup, which is very important and something that I think we can all benefit from. Some of the prerequisites: you need at least one core and 8 gig of memory per VIO. If you're using shared storage pools, you need at least 16 gig. And you do need to do calculations to figure out what you really need for memory, because all of the adapter cards that you have that have active ports each take a little bit of CPU and a little bit of memory. Although you can get by with a 30 gig root VG, I normally recommend at least 100 gig. That lets you put some log files and some larger page spaces, etc. within root VG. I also always make sure that I have a second free disk that I can use so that whenever I'm doing updates, I can use an alternate disk upgrade. But additionally, if you're upgrading from version 2 to version 3, you're required to have that second disk, and it needs to be the same size as the primary one. I usually try to add a third disk, which I use for file backed optical, and that's how I share things out as if they were on CDs. In order to go to the very latest version of the VIO server, your LPAR must actually be at AIX 7252. That allows you to run version 3.1.2.21 of the VIO. Also be aware that PowerVM 3.1 only supports the Power 7 Plus D models and above. It does not support any of the blades. The command that you're going to use for the upgrade if you're going from version 2 to version 3 is the VIOS upgrade command. There are two versions of that, one with NIM and one that runs on the actual VIO server. Just be a little bit cautious because they are different and have different syntax. Your VIO server is going to need at least 4 gigabytes of memory, but I have noticed that version 3.1.2, it seems to require at least 6 gigabytes and wouldn't boot with less. I never ever allocate less than 8 gig, and nowadays, depending on the number of high-performance adapters, it could be anywhere up to 12 gig. In terms of cores, you're looking at least a half a core entitlement and 2 virtual processors, and it may be more than that per VIO depending on how many client LPARs and how many physical adapters, etc. that you're going to have to manage. So in terms of planning, I would recommend planning for a minimum of 8 gig and an entitlement of 1.5 to 2 cores per LPAR, and that way you know that you'll have enough. You don't give it the VIO server that much up front, but you should plan for it. Adapter placement can be very important because adapter slots have different priorities, so that's something else that you want to have a look at. And then again, down the bottom, I mentioned that root VG needs at least 30 gig. I typically give it 100 gig of disk space per VIO so that I can increase the size of the page files and also so I can add log files. I keep a very clean root VG, but I do keep my log files in their own file system in root VG. Server memory is something that's very important, and understanding the overhead for memory is also important. When an LPAR is created, the system looks at the profile for that LPAR and looks at the maximum memory setting, and it performs a calculation and determines how much memory to hold for that LPAR for hypervisor page tables. That's so that you can use dynamic LPAR to increase or shrink memory and know that there's enough page tables to do the real to virtual translations. So if you look at this case here, every LPAR was set up with a maximum of 100 gig, even though some of the LPARs were very tiny. So what that did was reserved a significant amount of real memory to use for page tables that was not available for any LPAR to use. If you look below, you'll see that there's a better example where I looked at each LPAR and said, well, what am I likely to need to grow to? And I set the maximum memory settings appropriately. When you're looking at the output of an HMC scanner report, you will actually see a line under the servers that says firmware gigabytes, and that's what the red arrow is pointing to. In this particular case, they were using hypervisor memory mirroring, so that actually did double the amount of memory that was needed for this LPAR. But this is something that you should pay attention to, because that 90 gigabytes is not available for any LPAR to use, and it gets taken before the LPAR gets assigned its memory. So let's talk about some fundamentals before we start. I talk about this in all my presentations, but it really is important that you stay current. If you look at this list, which is from the IBM Flirt Lite site, you'll see that all VIO servers that are less than 3.1.2.10 will be end of service by November 30th, 2021. So if you're on any level prior to that and you place a service call to IBM, there's a very good chance that unless you've paid for the upgraded service, that you will get told that you need to do an upgrade before they can help you. So you can avoid this simply by staying current. This slide just shows you the service life for the various VIO server levels. And this one here shows you the minimum NIM master levels. So if you're using a NIM server and you're backing up your VIOs to it and you hope to restore a VIO to it from it, then you need to make sure that your NIM server is at the very latest level. And as of August 15th, it was AIX 725 Service Pack 2. And that is required to support VIO server 31221. So the VIO server 3.1 has been around since November 2018. There have been various mini packs, and the very latest came out in April in 2021, which is 31221. You can install directly from a USB stick, by using the flash copy that you can download. You can also install directly from DVDs at 31220 and then upgrade to 31221. You can also do an upgrade to 310 and then upgrade from there. There's a number of different ways you can do the upgrade. This code is downloaded from the entitled software site. Unfortunately, this is not an FTP or SFTP download. You have to go there using your web browser, log in, go find the code, download it, and then upload it to your server. More recently, I've only been bothering with the flash copies because that's a single DVD and it comes with a single integrated makes this be image that I can use, that I don't have to combine together with other images. And that flash image will fit on a 16 gigabyte USB stick. And then the note down the bottom that I have is, if you're installing a new server, please read the red book for that server to make sure that the VIO server level, HMC, etc. are supported. I also use the 6-level recommendation tool, and I check all of the prereqs to make sure that I'm installing everything that I need to be installing. Keeping it simple and consistent is really important. There's a lot of things you can do with a VIO server. Things incredibly complicated. I install all my VIO servers the same way. I install them very, very consistently, and I try to keep them as simple as possible. The more complicated you make it, the more difficult it is to debug things when they go wrong. The LMB, or logical memory block size, is also known as the memory region option, and that's something that you put in the settings for the server. That needs to be the same on all the servers if you want to use live partition mobility. And typically it defaults to 256 megabytes, but you should check that on your servers because the only way to change it is to power off the server. I also recommend using hot pluggable adapters. That lets you do maintenance. You can actually replace the adapters without powering off the server, but those adapters need to be set as desired, not as required in the LPAR, or you can't do it. Additionally, LPM will not allow you to LPM an LPAR that has any adapters set to required. I also always do dual VIO servers. That allows me to do concurrent updates. For the smaller servers, that means you need to ensure that they do a split backplane on the server. Sometimes people forget that, and then you can't have two sets of disks split between two different VIO servers. So that's something to watch for. Also watching that the VLAN numbers on the trunk adapters match. And I do things like running HMC scanner or get a sysplan before and after I make any changes. That basically makes sure that I have up-to-date documentation. And I also plan for at least one, preferably two, updates per year. I plan for that for the HMC, for the server firmware, for the VIO servers, for everything that I can. I know getting maintenance windows is a difficult thing, but getting behind and having a problem and being told, well, you need to do an emergency upgrade because the problem you have was fixed in that, is not really where you want to be. And one of the last comments I have is testing failover. You want to test your shared Ethernet adapter failover and your disk in case the VIO goes down. So one of the last things that I typically do after an upgrade is I'll shut one VIO down completely. I'll check some LPARs and make sure they're still okay. And then I'll bring that VIO up and I'll shut the other VIO down and see what happens. Because I want to make sure that I don't lose network connectivity or disk connectivity to any of my LPARs. Whenever you're working on a VIO server to do any kind of an update, do not try to force things through using root. You should always use the VIO commands. So if you want to patch Java or SSH or SSL, put the stuff in its own directory and use the update iOS command. Don't just do SMIDI. You should also mirror your root VG if you're using internal disks, but if you're on the SAN, there's no need to do that. However, you will still need a spare disk in your VIO so that you can take a clone using alt disk copy prior to doing any updates. I have a comment here on paging because by default, when you install a VIO server, it installs two page datasets on the same LUN, which is an absolute no-no. In some cases, it's a 512 meg HD6 and a 1.5 gig paging 00. I've also seen it where they're both 1 gig. So if you see that, you should increase the size of HD6 and just delete paging 00. You don't ever want your VIO server to be paging, but particularly if you're on internal disk, you certainly don't want it to be paging between two page spaces on the same physical disk that are different sizes. I also always add logging, and I set up the dump devices properly to make sure that they're actually capable of holding a dump if I need to take one. And I run the part command regularly to see how my VIOs are behaving. And then the last couple of comments are making sure that somebody's keeping an eye on the error log, which is the ERRPT command, and making sure that you don't ever run your VIO servers regularly at 100% entitlement. It's okay to go over occasionally, but anytime you're running at entitlement, you're impacting your performance for the network and for the SAN, but particularly the network, so pay attention to that. And lastly, please take backups. People think about backups and they think about their data, but you really need to have bootable makes this be images that you can restore from, because if you can't restore your VIO servers, then you're not going to be able to run any of your LPARs. And that leads into one last thing, which is when you're setting up a NIM server, you should try to make sure it is independent of any VIO servers that it needs to be used to restore. Because if the VIO server is in control of the NIM server, then it's going to be very difficult to restore that that VIO server from NIM server. VIO environments can become incredibly complicated. So it's very important to take good documentation. I typically, when I'm building something, pre-document all the steps that I'm going to do anyway, and I depend heavily on the HMC scanner or sysplan to start putting my documentation together. I keep track of all kinds of things, from equipment and serial numbers to universal access key expiration dates. I try to get the customer numbers, server and IO firmware levels. All the things that are listed on this page are things that I try to keep track of in my documentation, because I would rather do that as I'm building it than try to go back and retrofit it, and more importantly, suddenly find I have no documentation and I've had a bit of a disaster and have to rebuild everything. So documentation is a very critical part of your VIO server environment. I mentioned earlier about using dual VIO servers. What dual VIO servers typically allow you to do is concurrent updates. I can update one VIO while the other VIO is running the network and the storage. I can also use them for failover, so that if something happens to a disk in one VIO, the other VIO can still run everything. So I have a lot more redundancy and flexibility. And there are also certain environments where dual VIO is actually required. There's some things you can do with multiple VIOs, such as have one pair managing everything, or you can have one pair for the network and one pair for disk I/O. You can separate them for development and production. You have a number of different options for how you can do the VIOs. For the most part, what I see is people having two VIOs that manage everything. I mentioned earlier using VIO commands for maintenance. If you're doing regular updates within a version, then you're going to use the update iOS command. So typically you would copy whatever it is that you're doing for an update into its own directory, and then you would use update iOS and point it at that directory and to do the upgrade. Now, for actual upgrades, which is where you're changing versions, you need to use the viosupgrade command. And there are two different versions. There's one that the NIM uses, and there's a different version with slightly different syntax that runs on the actual VIO server. So whatever your strategy is, you should pick one of those two and always do it the same way. Now, if you need to update Java SSH SSL, or you need to add some disk support modules or something like that, the way that I do that is I put them in their own directory. So you can see here where I'm doing it with Java SSH and SSL. And then I use the update iOS command to actually install those updates. There's only one exception to this rule about using VIO commands, and that is when you're doing IO firmware updates, because that uses the diag command. And actually there's a second one, which is when you're doing hyper patches, efixes or ifixes, which uses eManager. And those hypers, which we'll talk about a little bit later, are basically for patches that have to go on but that are not part of a service pack or technology level. So we'll talk now about hypers and other fixes. I already talked about updating Java SSH SSL. What this slide goes into is how to actually go and get SSH and SSL, because you get those from the web download pack, and then you get Java from Fix Central. Once you've got them downloaded, you put them into a directory, and then you can see the update iOS commands. As of version 3.1.0.21, the VIO server no longer requires Java 6 or Java 7. So it does require Java 8, but you only need the SDK and JRE. So as long as those are installed, you can actually remove Java 6 and Java 7. Efixes and ifixes are typically identified by running something called FlirtVC, which is the Fixed Level Recommendation Tool vulnerability checker. I run this on all my LPARs after I do updates to find out what patches they need. And it will identify patches such as things that fix NPIV bugs or other high performance problems that could actually take you down. It also provides you with the list of where to get those patches and how to install them. So the command that you're going to use for putting efixes and ifixes on is the eManager command. And this is an example here of what you need on 3.1.2.21 as of August 3rd this year, after I updated SSH, SSL and Java. So as time goes by, there'll be more of these, but the most important one right now is this IJ31936, which is where an AIX MPIV client may crash. And then you can see at the bottom of the page that when I ran it on August 24, it did identify an additional patch that had to go on, and it had to do with IP version 6 traffic. But as you can see, it actually gives you the actual patch where it gets fixed, which will be at 7254, and it gives you a link to a description of the problem, and then it tells you where to go to actually download that patch. There's a VIO server hyper website that I've provided the link for here, and that's where you'll find the list of all of the latest VIO server hypers. One point to note is that the fixes are typically accessed using FTP or HTTPS, and they're going to be either in ifixes and efixes, or there is also a security subdirectory. So you will need to download them to your desktop and then upload them to your LPAR unless your LPAR has external FTP access to IBM. Sometimes before you do an update, you will need to remove efixes and ifixes, and that is done with the emanager-r-L command. It's also important to have a plan in case things go wrong with your upgrade. The obvious thing is to reboot from the disk that you didn't change, which is why I do the alt disk copy. However, before you do that, you want to do a little bit of gathering of data for IBM in case you're going to open a PMR. So I always make sure I have the latest perf PMR downloaded and that I know how to get a perf PMR and also how to run a snap. So I always will take a snap and I'll take a perf PMR so that I have something to upload to IBM when I open a support ticket. And I'm also very good about pre-documenting my VIO servers because I'm going to have to provide a lot of information, and that's what the HMC scanner does for me. I mentioned updating your IO firmware, and that's a very important piece to do. Your VIO servers are typically in control of all of your IO adapters. So you're going to want to update your fiber cards, you're going to want to update your network cards, and possibly your disk drives. So you can go to Fix Central and select PowerIO firmware. On the LPAR, you just run LSM code -A. It'll tell you your current firmware level, and then it will list all your adapters and what level they're at. You do need to know what kind of adapters you have. So you need to know it's an EN0T or an EN0F or an EN1B, whatever it is. And then you can plug that in at Fix Central, and it will put you a link to the RPM file that you will need to be able to install that microcode. On your VIO servers, you put them in a local directory, and then you can use the rpm-ivh command to point to the specific file. All that does is it basically puts the necessary stuff into /etc microcode. At this point, you haven't actually changed anything. It's not until you run the diag command that the actual changes go on. So here's an example where I'm changing fiber adapters. So I run the diag-dfcs0 command, and it will go and it will give me a selection from /etc microcode of the levels that are there, and I can pick the correct one. Keep in mind that if you're changing fiber ports in a dual VIO server, you'll find that the LPARs that are clients will lose half their paths during the update, because when you put patches on a fiber adapter, it's going to take that adapter down and up. If you're a single VIO system, then you need to bring your LPARs down. Sometimes you have to do it on every FCS port. Sometimes, if it's a multi-port card, it may do all of them at the same time. You'll be able to tell when the diag command runs. You do not run this against the fiber channel adapter that shows up on the 10 gig, 1 gig network cards. They will actually be updated automatically when you update the network card itself. When you're doing updates on the network, what you may want to do is force a failover. By default, the SEA should failover properly to the other VIO server. However, one of the things I like to do is be logged on through the network to both VIOs, and then I change it to standby, and if the primary does it properly, the secondary will become the primary, and I shouldn't get logged off. If I get logged off, then I immediately set it back and try to figure out what's wrong with my SEA. And then you can see down below there's an example of the commands to actually update my Ethernet adapters. Now, if it's a network card on the VIO and it's in the SEA, you may need to unconfigure the SEA and the Ether channel after you do that standby. So these are the commands here for downing and detaching the adapter, and then doing a logical remove. Do the update on the adapter and then run config manager, and it should bring everything back. I would highly recommend that prior to doing this that you run SMTI TCP/IP and make sure you know what all your IP settings are. Maybe run a netstat-rn and just document all that, just in case it doesn't come back the way that it is supposed to. Your VIO server needs a lot of resources. It should be your most loved one because it is in control of the resources for all of the client LPARs. So you want to give it the highest weight. You want to make sure it has plenty of entitlement and plenty of memory. And you're also going to want to do things like tuning the fiber adapter settings and some of the virtual buffers, and you're going to want to monitor it. In terms of tuning your HBAs, I typically will set max transfer size and num command elements. And how I set those is going to depend on the disk subsystem I am connected to. It is really important that you set the VIO server to at least the same value as the highest value used by any client. And that VIO server must be rebooted so that that change is in place before you make any changes to the clients. The max transfer size on the HBA is not the same thing as the max transfer on a disk. This is the IO DMA size, and by default it's set to 16 meg. Then there's 3 different settings you can use that will get you a 128 meg DMA. I always set mine to the 0x200000, and if I need more than that, I will set it to the larger number. Depending on the bus that I have, I may get 256 meg or 128 meg. But typically I'm finding that the 0x20, which is the 128 meg, is plenty of DMA space unless I'm driving really large IOs. And again, the client setting for this cannot be higher than the VIOs were booted with. By default, I also set certain tunables on my VIO servers. By default, send space and receive space for TCP and UDP are not tuned. They're set way too low, and RFC 1323 = 1 needs to be set. Otherwise, TCP send and receive can't use more than 16 meg, and as you can see, I'm using 256 here. Sorry, 16K. And you can see down the bottom of this little script, I also set my fiber adapter settings. You only have to run that script once. I also tune my virtual buffers, and I tune those so that I don't run out of buffers. I do something a little different here. I set the buff mode to min, and what that does is it allows me to have a gap between minimum and maximum. If I don't have that gap, which is the default, then I can't tell if I'm running out of buffers, because max allocated will always show the same number as maximum, even if it's not using them. And now we're going to talk about installing your VIO servers. The latest version on August 24th was version 3.1.2.21. You can download the ISOs for 31220, which is a 2 DVD set, or you can download the flash image for 31221, which is what I always do, because it's a single ISO image and it's going to save me a step. So you go to ESS, log in, download everything, and you can burn it to DVD, and the flash image you can actually burn to a 16 gigabyte USB stick. This is just showing you a list, what the listing looks like of all the things that you have, and you can see that one of them is called 31221 Flash 04-2021, and that's my flash image. So the options I have, I can download 31220 and 31221, and I can then upgrade from 31220. If I'm upgrading from version 2 of the VIO, I download the 31125 flash image, and I go from 226 to 31125, and then I go to 312, and then 31221. So there are steps that you have to take, and if you're very back level, it's going to be a multi-step update. When you're changing versions, as I said earlier, you need to use VIOS upgrade, and it will require an alternate disk. And there are some minimum required levels before you can do that, which so for me is 226.2 minimum. You can use LPM and take everything off the server and do a fresh install. You can install from USB or DVD. You can upgrade from those. You can copy the images onto a directory on your system and upgrade from there. You have lots of different options, and you can also, if you're doing a fresh install from the HMC. And at the latest HMC levels, you can now actually back up and restore a VIO server to and from your HMC. Some things to think about for a fresh install. Version 3 fresh install is no different to a version 2 fresh install. If you are replacing a current VIO server, obviously you're going to want to LPM everything off. You're going to want to run VIOSBR to back up your metadata. If you are using logical volumes, you need to back them up. If you have anything outside of root VG on your VIO server, you'll need to back it up. And again, you know, I use the flash image, so I just use the makesysb image from the flash image. You should always, before doing any kind of an update, check for compatibility with the HMC firmware and VIO server levels, as well as your client operating systems. The last thing you want to do is update your VIO server and then find out that, oh, I had a Power 7 attached and it doesn't support anything below Power 7 Plus. You need to check all of those things. I use VIOSBR to back up my virtual definitions. And if you use the VIOSBR command, you can either use the view command or you can just do an ls on this config backups directory to look at all of your VIO backups. I have it set up to automatically back up every day. So you'll see something in cron tab that basically says, you know, backup every day, keep the last 7. And so I know that I always have a good copy. When you do the version 3 upgrade, one of the first things it does is also an additional VIOSBR. So prior to the install, we're going to back up anything outside of root VG. Obviously, if it's a completely fresh install, there's nothing to back up, but just to be aware. And as I said, you need to back up logical volumes, and then you should always take a backup of the VIO server. I typically take 3 backups because I'm paranoid. I take a regular backup, which would be a makesysb image. I take a backup that I could always put on the HMC so to restore from, and then I also take an alt disk copy. And I already mentioned before that when you're working on a primary VIO, you may want to fail the SEA over. There are some issues related to installing from the HMC or from NIM if you've aggregated the network. Typically, network installs are only supported over an access port connection. Now, there is a way around that in SMS mode, so that is an option for you. What a lot of people like to do is just have a separate 1 gig administration port, and that's what they use for installs and for administrative access. But that's entirely up to you. Just be aware that sometimes you have problems with the network being aggregated. And if you are installing onto SanDisks, the LAN team might need you to light up the adapters so they can do their zoning and mapping. So one way to do it is to boot the VIO into SMS mode and then use the display adapter WWPN command. You have to get the full port name in order to get that WWPN. So this would be, you know, whatever the node. This is from a 880, so it's the node and the serial number of the drawer has to be plugged in and so on. But it will come back with the WWPN. Sorry, the WWN. If you're doing a full install from DVD or USB, you basically boot an SMS and tell it to boot from the DVD, the flash, NIM or HMC. Follow the instructions. There's links here for all of those, so I'm not going to go into how to do that. And then after the install, you're going to fix those page spaces and do your logging and the regular cleanup things you would do for an install. You do have the ability to import the VIO server flash image into your HMC. So these are some examples of how you would actually do that. And as you can see, I have imported the 31221 image. You only get 15 gig on your HMC for this, so you're not really going to be able to store a lot of images, so be prepared to delete old ones. You can use NIM to back up or install and update your VIO server, but you need to make sure that your NIM master is at the right level. So for VIO 3.1.2.21, you have to be at AIX 7.2.5.2. And I mentioned earlier that the NIM master, when you're going from version 2 to version 3, you can use the viosupgrade command on the VIO server, or you can use it on the NIM master in alternate disk mode. The syntax is different for the two of them, so you really need to make sure that you pick one and do all of your VIOs that way. Also be aware that when you mount the flash ISO, you need to actually mount it using the UDFS flag. Otherwise it will not mount, and you won't be able to copy the makesSB image out of it, because you're going to need to extract that makesSB in order to be able to do the upgrade. So when you're using the NIM server for VIO servers, you add the VIO server partition just like you would a normal NIM client. You copy that makesSB image from the CD to your NIM master. On the flash, there's only one image, and it's one large one. On the other two DVD images, there are actually three makesSB images, and they must be concatenated in the correct order. So that's another reason why I use the flash image, because then I don't have to worry about concatenating things. This slide also lists the various steps that you need to go through. The most important thing is that you're going to build a spot from that makesSB. You never build a spot for a VIO server from an LPP source. In fact, there is no LPP source for a VIO server. You'll have a spot, you'll have a makesSB image, and there's typically a separate BOSIDS data. And then you can basically use those images to do a makesSB install of your VIO server, or you can use them for the NIM version of viosupgrade. So in this next section, we're going to look at doing maintenance and upgrading your VIOs. One of the first things you need to do when upgrading a VIO server is run lsvopt. Make sure nobody has any of the file-backed optical devices mounted. Also, if you're using NPIV tape drives, you need to make sure they're not in use. It's very common in an IBM I environment to have those tape drives in use, so you need to make sure that they're not activated on the IBM I LPARs and that no one is using them. I normally upgrade the HMC first, then firmware, then the VIOs, and then AIX. But you need to check the READMEs to make sure that there isn't a different order. And the example I'm giving here is for the firmware 940 for the Power 9, you had to update any I/O adapters that were being used for boot before you did the firmware update, and the HMC had to be updated prior to the firmware as well. So just little things to watch for. You need to read those READMEs and cross-reference them. I always run ERRPT, look for problems. If there's stale partitions, missing disks or paths, I'm not going to do the update. I'm going to fix that problem first. So there's a list of commands that you should use for checking that. And I want to make sure that all my paths are redundant, because if on the clients those paths aren't redundant, when I reboot this VIO server, those LPARs are going to go down. I always run HMC scanner and sysplan. I take a backup and I take an alt disk copy. And then I mount the NFS file system or the DVD or the FPO image or the ISO, whatever I'm going to use for the update. I make sure the files are local on that VIO server so that if I do lose my network, I don't lose access to the files I'm updating from in the middle of my update. And then once I do my upgrade and I've rebooted the first VIO server, I check that all my LPARs are back to dual paths. That can take anywhere from 2 minutes to 30 minutes, but I make sure they're back before I start on the second VIO. And I always do my 2 VIOs in a pair on the same day, because you run the risk of corruption if you leave them running on different levels for too long. If you're using shared storage pools, there's some additional steps that you must take prior to the update and after the update, and those are outlined in the VIO server README. I've already mentioned this, but going from version 2 to version 3 is an upgrade, not an update. So you have to use the upgrade command, the VIOS upgrade. We're going to take a backup. I also create a files to save.txt file, and in that I have a list of files that I think are important that I want to save. And it saves them in a specific directory off of home/padmin. I back up anything outside root VG, and like I've said before, I take backups, I do my upgrade. The upgrade should restore the metadata, and then I can go and restore anything outside of root VG, and I can do my post-upgrade steps. In this slide, I provided some information on some of the prerequisite levels for your upgrades. Depending on which version you're coming from, you may end up having to do a multi-step upgrade. As an example, if you're on 2.2.6, then you're going to have to go to version 3.1.0 or 3.1.1.40 before you can go to version 3.1.2. And at the bottom you can see I'm just providing a little picture of what you would see on the Fix Central site when you go to look at the service pack for a VIO server update. So I've talked before about getting the MakesSB image off the ISO, and this is how you do the actual copies. And I always copy that locally to the VIO just in case I lose the network during the install. This is a list of the files that I think are important for me to save. So I actually create this file in /home/padmin, and they will end up in home padmin backup files after the upgrade. And when I run the version 3 upgrade, I actually tell it to use that file to make sure that it saves files that I care about. Those files must exist or your upgrade will fail. Before you do the upgrade, you have to have a second empty disk. So if you look here, you'll see that all my disks were in use. And when I did an LSPV-free or -unused, it didn't show me anything. So I have to actually export VG, alt-inst-root VG, because you can't actually have an alt-inst-root VG when you're doing a VIOS upgrade, because the first thing it does is create that. So this is a case where I forgot to clear the disk, and it came back and said provided disk H disk 1 is in use. So I went back, cleaned it up, where I exported it, and I then could see the actual disk. And by the way, the recommendation nowadays is to always use alt-root VG op rather than export VG. So I decided to clear the boot image and also clear the owning volume manager, because when I did an LSPV-free, it didn't show me any free disks. But now, as you can see, once I did all that, I can see that I have one free disk, which is H disk 1. So now I can do my upgrade. I was at 2.2.6.32. So I run my iOS level, I do my update iOS commit, I make sure there is no efix data on the system because it insists that you remove any efixes before this upgrade. And then I'm going to look at running VIOS upgrade. So if you look at the command I have here, I'm basically telling it to do a VIO server upgrade, and I'm going to use the VIO server 3.1.1.25 flash image, and I'm going to go to HDisk 1, and the files that I want it to save first are in my home padmin files to save.txt. And down below I have all of the various flags and what they mean. So this is running VIOS upgrade on the VIO server. This is showing you what it looks like for the output from the upgrade. So you'll see there's a welcome, it tells you what it's doing. It basically creates alt-inst-root VG, and then when it's done it puts it to sleep, and then you have 60 seconds before it reboots. You can hit Control-C if you're not ready to reboot. Personally, I time this for a time when I want it to reboot. It will then reboot, and then it will do a VIOS-BR-restore to restore all your metadata. And after that, it may reboot a couple more times. So don't be surprised if you get excited, you log into the VIO server and it suddenly reboots out from under you. Once you log in, you have to accept the license, and then you can run VIOS upgrade-L-Q to see what happened. And well, you should see something that looks like this, where it says started and triggered and restored. and you could then do a VIOS BR-view or whatever to see what's going on. And I logged in too soon the first time and it rebooted at least once more, so you might want to wait 10 minutes before you log in. After the upgrade, you should see an iOS level. In my case, it was 31125, and then I do the various commands to make sure I'm not missing any file sets. It's a completely free install, but it does restore your virtual definitions. So you still have to go through if you've added logging file systems, if you've modified paging, if you've made changes to Etsy environment or Etsy profile, if you've set any tunables, which I always do, that all has to be redone. If you have backup scripts for Nmon or taking backups or anything, those all have to be re-added. And now, in this I'm actually able to go and update to VIOS 31221 from 31125. So I run a commit and then I use update iOS because I'm within the same version to do my update. Run my same checks, make sure it's where I want it. The one thing that it does do is, because it's a complete replacement, it puts everything back in inetd.conf. I typically clean out my inetd.conf of everything except for things that I want to use so that I don't end up running insecure protocols. After the upgrade or install, you're going to want to update Java, SSH, and SSL, get those all cleaned up, remove the old versions of Java like Java 6 and Java 7. And then when you're done with updating SSL, and this is something you should do whenever you update SSL in any LPAR, you should run update vpackage. If you don't do that, the links don't get updated and some of your third-party software may fail. And then I end up running flirtvc and I put on any identified efixes or ifixes. I also set up NTP, and NTP is actually configured in a different location on your VIO servers. So I configure it in both just to be safe. And you can point it at your own NTP servers or you can use the US pool servers. After the install, I run a bunch of checks to make sure that I am not missing any file sets. I like to have a very clean system. Also check ERRPT, and I make sure that all my clients are happy. And if I was running on internal disks, I'll probably leave it a week and then I'll remirror rootvg just in case I have to go back. And like I said, you have to rerun any tuning scripts. And when you're done, you should back up both your VIO servers. And one thing I did notice is that the backups are smaller. If you have a problem, these are the various locations for the log files that you may need to look at. And then I've just got a couple of comments on what to do if you have problems. So when I was running my 226.32 update, there were a couple of times when I ran OS level that the 226 update actually ended up showing a very strange level. I've not seen this doing a 3.1 upgrade, but when I had to upgrade from 226.21 to 226.32 prior to doing a version 3 upgrade, I saw some of this. Normally when you see these things, there's missing file sets. If you have to find missing file sets, you could do this OS level -S, and it will tell you which file sets are your problems. And then you can either update them or remove them using update iOS. So this is showing you how to update them and how to remove them. And then of course you're going to run your eManager command to put on any patches. I normally have a directory called missing, where as I find file systems file sets that are missing, I put them in there so I know where to find them. As I said, this has not been an issue since I moved to version 3, but it was definitely an issue that occurred regularly with version 2. On that note, I'd really like to thank you for your time, and I hope you found this useful. I do have a copy of the presentation uploaded at the link that I'm showing you there, but they will also be obviously at the PTEP site. I hope you have a good week and enjoy the conference. Thank you for your time.